Hi there. Firstly, sorry for any issues with the audio quality. You'll notice I'm not in my usual recording place today. I just want to make a really quick video about these new M3 chips, and particularly the benchmarks we're seeing. There's been some controversy over the M3 Pro only having about a 6% performance improvement over the M2 Pro in benchmarks. And this raises some interesting questions, because if you're in the market for a new MacBook, and particularly if you're coming from one of the older Intel processors, you're probably wondering, do I really need a new M3 chip, or could I get similar performance at a much better price with one of the M1 or M2 chips? So I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at these benchmarks and compare them not only across the generations, so M1 to M2 to M3, but also across the different tiers, so Base, Pro, Max and Ultra. So let's take a look. All the scores in this video are taken from the Geekbench browser, by the way. So you can see here that the single core scores are all pretty much the same, and that's what we would expect, because there's no difference in the individual cores of a Pro or a Max chip. The difference is in how many of them that there are. So this is pretty much what we would expect to be seeing. There are slight variations. That's probably due to higher end chips being more likely to be in higher end machines like the MacBook Pro, where there's a fan, there's active cooling, so those cores can run slightly hotter. This graph, not that interesting. What is interesting is when we look at the multi-core scores. So just looking at the base chips, there's been a fairly modest increase over the generations. If you're coming from an Intel chip, you'll notice a big jump. You're probably unlikely to notice as much coming from an M1 or M2. When we look at the Pros, now there's two different Pro scores for the M1 and M2 generations. This is because there was a bin version, a lower end version, that had two of the performance cores disabled. I'll put the details up on screen of the exact core configurations. In the M3 generation, there is a bin version, but there's only one core difference. And you can see that even in the higher end Pro chip, there's fewer performance cores than in the M2 Pro, 6 versus 8. And that is maybe the reason we're seeing such a small performance increase, that 6% number you've been hearing about. I wonder if this was due to yield issues, so like Apple just physically couldn't make the Pro with 8 performance cores in large enough quantities. But probably it's an attempt at differentiating that Max chip from the Pro. I have another theory actually, that maybe they're dialing down the performance of that Pro chip with a view to putting it into a future higher end MacBook Air, possibly. Who knows? But looking at this graph suggests that if you were thinking about getting a new MacBook Pro with the M3 Pro chip, it might be worth just sticking with the M2 Pro. At least for CPU performance, there's really not much difference. I will look at graphics performance in a bit. Looking at the Max chip now, we can see that in the M1 and M2 generations, there was no difference in multi-core score between the Pro and Max chips. And that's expected, because in that generation, there was no difference between those chips in terms of the number of CPU cores. The only differentiating factor was on GPU cores. Now in the M3 generation, the Max now has twice as many performance cores as the Pro. So there is a differentiation now. There's actually a bin version of the Max now with 14 cores instead of 16. And you can see even with that lower end Max chip, it's still wiping the floor with the M3 Pro. It is quite interesting to look at the Ultra scores, even though these are desktop only chips, because look at the higher end M3 Max against the M2 Ultra. There's barely any difference there. So that's quite a compelling pitch for the M3 Max. You're getting the same CPU performance as last generation's Ultra chip. So that's pretty compelling. And looking at this overall multi-core graph, one thing stands out. The M3 Pro is a bad deal. You're better off going with the M2 Pro or even an M1 Max. Remember, the M1 Max was an incredibly powerful chip when it was released, and guess what? It still is. If you want to save some money, that's a great option. If you do want an M3 chip though, and you need the power, you're going to get a lot more for your money with the M3 Max. That's only half the story though. We still need to look at the GPU scores. I'm looking at the Metal scores. Metal is Apple's low-level graphics API. So with the base chips, you can see there's very minor but steady improvements, but really not that much difference. You'll only have 8 to 10 graphics cores with the base chip. You can do video editing, of course. You can probably even run less intensive games. I mean, my sister will tell you The Sims runs great on the base M1 chip. But the base chips are just not designed for gaming. They're not designed for graphics-heavy applications, so just bear that in mind. Looking at the Pro chip, and by the way, both the Pro and Max chip have binned versions, but all these scores are averages. They're not separated out on this graph. So again, modest increases. And that's partly because of how big I had to make the y-axis for the Max and Ultra chips. So the Max has a nice steady increase over the generations. I think even if you're coming from M1, you'll see really good improvements here. With things like games, you're going to see a substantial increase in frame rate. And now just for fun, let's look at the Ultras. Now we don't have the M3 Ultra chip yet, obviously, but you can see if the trend continues, the M3 Ultra benchmark is going to be literally off the chart. So that's pretty exciting. The interesting thing about the graphics benchmarks, though, is that we're not seeing, for instance, the M3 Pro outperforming the M1 Max like we did on the multi-core benchmark. We are seeing the M3 Max get pretty close to the M1 Ultra. Again, a really powerful chip when it was released. Apple essentially had to fuse two chips together and call it an Ultra to get that performance 18 months ago. Now you can get the equivalent of that in a laptop with the M3 Max. That's pretty crazy. You are also getting extra graphics stuff in the M3 Pro and Max, like hardware accelerated ray tracing, mesh shading, the new dynamic caching technology. So that's something also to be aware of, that if you decide to go for one of the previous generations, you won't get those features. You also won't get the new hardware accelerated AV1 decoding, which will make things like watching YouTube on your laptop much less battery intensive. So that's just a quick roundup of what the benchmarks are looking like. I hope that helps you visualize the differences and make a decision on what's best for you. Let me know in the comments what you decide on and why. For me, I think the most important benchmark is that space black color, so I'll probably be going for the M3 Max. But let me know what you think. And please do subscribe. I'll have more Apple related videos coming up, including one where I look at Apple's upcoming AI type system. If you think that sounds interesting, please do subscribe. And if you don't, please subscribe anyway, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to afford a new MacBook Pro. Thanks for watching. See you next time.